Thank you, Chris. And welcome, everyone, to our Plan for Water meeting on October 10th. And I really appreciate everyone being here, both online and in person. So thanks on behalf of the board and management. And with that, we will say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Chris?
Yes. Division 1.
Here.
Division 2.
Here.
Division 3.
Here.
Division 4. Absent. Division 5.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, President Hall. So it's been a little while since we met. As the board is aware, we did have a board meeting to review the results from the primary modeling effort scheduled, it was about a month ago or so. And because of the complexity of the data, we decided to pull back a little bit to give the board a little bit more time to digest the data, ask questions, and do a little bit of a deeper dive. So we are here today, and I think, Jared, are you taking the lead?
Yep.
So we are here today to discuss results from the modeling. So this is really the meat of the entire Plan for Water effort. So it's been an accumulation of a lot of hard work from the consultant team and Doug's team. So we appreciate all of you. It's taken a lot of very, very smart brains to put this forward. And today we will review the information, ask any questions, and then any members of the public that would like to participate or have any questions, please use the chat feature or raise your hand, and we'll get to you as soon as possible. And then, as everyone knows, this is a fairly open process, so if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to make them. We do ask that everyone try to stay on topic as much as possible because we do have a hard stop at 6 p.m.
I just wanted to also add that one of the decisions that came out of postponing the original meeting that we had scheduled was to give management a chance to develop this very helpful complementary document to go with the slide materials. And that certainly, I think, helped answer some questions and elaborate on some of the details, helps us to interpret. So I appreciate the effort that management took to do this.
And thank you, Jared and Marco and everybody on their team for helping us. Please note that there is one little thing we noticed today is that the notes handout references specific slides, but the numbers on the hard copy of the slides, it starts page 1 on the first page of the staff report, so it's off by 2 pages. So if you're asking a question or we're discussing a specific slide and you're trying to refer back to any of the notes, please also state what the title of the slide is so that we can ensure everyone is literally on the same page. All right, well, we'll get started then. And we're gonna try to get through this 6 p.m. and
Jennifer, can I just ask, and so the goal at the end of this meeting is what? What
the goal of the meeting is, it's not to make, there is some additional decisions that have to be made related to the strategy alternative analysis. And those would be any strategies that are determined would be a potential alternative for addressing any unmet demand needs, whether or not we would like to see some additional modeling completed on those efforts. Now, some strategies lend themselves to modeling and some strategies do not lend themselves to modeling. So we're going to have that discussion further. That's it. All right.
All right. Welcome. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking.
Can you pull your closer, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about, as Jennifer said, the Plan for Water reservoir modeling. So first we're going to go over just a little review of the tool that we're using to do the reservoir modeling. We're going to do a review of the projected climate change hydrology that was developed as an input. We're going to go over the projected demands that were developed as an input to the model. We're going to go over an overview of the scenarios that we've run. We're going to look at we're going to do a summary of some of the model results from those scenarios. And then we're gonna talk about some of the decisions that we're looking for going forward, which is a selection of some bookend scenarios with which to do further analysis, and the strategic alternatives, which is that further analysis. We'll talk a little bit about next steps after that. Did I want to shoot up? Yeah. So here's where we are in the process. We had developed historical hydrology and some historical demands. We put that into the reservoir operations model to calibrate the model to what has happened in the recent past. And then separately, we had a team go develop some climate change hydrology using
New batteries.
Sure, thanks. Using some global climate models. They ran that through a surface routing model to give us some projected hydrology. Separately, the IDC team went and developed an IDC model. They developed some projected consumptive demands. We've plugged both of those into the reservoir operations model. And now we've run 10 scenarios with those projected inputs. So the reservoir operations model is using the HEC-ResSim platform. We talked about this about 6 months ago. It's a model developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, specifically for doing reservoir operations model. It's all over the country. The main inputs are those IDC demands, the HEC-HMS watershed runoff, the inflows, and regulatory requirements, as well as operational rule of thumbs and some other various,
Yeah, thank you.
So you can just go say IDC, and sometimes it might be better to identify
Sure.
exactly what we're talking about.
What the acronyms are,
Okay.
Yeah.
because it has been a while.
Okay,
Thank
well, you'll forgive me if I don't actually know what the IDC acronym stands for.
Well, there we go.
He does.
It's short for IWFM demand calculator, but you can just think of it as irrigation demand calculator.
Irrigation.
IWFM is a numerical model developed by DWR, and this
Oh,
used to be
okay.
part of that, and they split it off and it became its own water balance model. It's short for IWFM demand calculator, that's ID.
Irrigation demand calculator. Thank
You
you.
can swap irrigation and IWFM, they're essentially the same.
Okay,
Sorry, just for point of.
well, that's really good.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
So again, those are the consumptive demands, both irrigation, the demands at your water treatment plants, your leakage in your canals, all the water it takes to deliver to all of your customers. HEC-HMS is a different Army Corps of Engineers model, which, thank you, takes precipitation and temperatures and develops how the water comes down off the hill, whether it's getting frozen up as snow, when it's being unlocked from that snow, coming down as snow melt, soil discharges. And so then the HEC-ResSim model, we've got our reservoirs, we've got your major conveyance canals, and it takes in those inputs, gets an optimized solution of how you would run your reservoirs with those inputs, and the outputs from that are river flows, reservoir storage, powerhouse flows, flows in your major conveyance canals, and end user deliveries.
So the power generation would be double use sometimes with river flows, environmental flows, it could be doubled up,
Yeah,
but it is counted by itself.
it's tracking every time water goes through a powerhouse on the way to somewhere else.
But it might be double counted,
No, yeah, that's my question.
because it might be,
I'm not, what do you,
well, it might be a delivery, might be diverted with, down.
Yeah, the water that's going through these powerhouses, it might get released later as minimum flows, it might be getting delivered, it might be getting stored.
I wouldn't say that it's double counted.
No, okay, but it's not,
It's not lost to
it's
the
not
system.
wasted.
No. It's recaptured and reused where we can.
that's the point, yeah.
Yes.
It's being tracked as we're moving water around the system.
But it's not a part of a total sum. I mean, it is, but
not double count it that way.
Right.
No.
Right.
And so, again, that's the tool that we're using for all of the analyses that we're going to talk about today. So, a review of the projected climate change hydrology. The climate change team went and looked at a number, I believe it's 10 or 11 global climate models that perform well in California. They looked at various emission scenarios, did an analysis of those, and picked 3 to use for these modeling studies. These are the 3. We have a high bookend, otherwise known as a wet bookend. We've got something that's more in the middle, and then we've got a low dry bookend. The names and the colors there are just the name of the global climate models. Couldn't tell you those acronyms either. And then everything after the underscore is an emission scenario. And so we have these projected inflows for water years 2022 through 2070.
Next slide.
Okay.
Next.
So for those 3 climate scenarios, this is a time series of the annual inflow volume to the model for each of those. We've got the wet in blue, median in green, and the dry in red. What you should notice from these annual inflows is that the dry has both very high inflow years and years with very low inflow. The wet also has years with very high inflow and very low inflow. In fact, some of the wettest years on here are from the dry scenario, and some of the driest years on here are from the wet scenario. Overall, you have a slightly different mix. A few more dry years in the dry scenario, a few more wet years in the wet scenario, but each of them have a range that generally covers the range that we've seen historically.
No, that's okay.
It'd be interesting to overlay the historical 1976 to 2021 over this, not just have the average year, but to see the volatility that we've experienced in real time historically.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, obviously, these years are 22 through 2070, but we could overlay just for the range, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful because we've had historical volatility, we know
Right.
that. And it doesn't, the straight line just doesn't.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Mhm.
To
Good, that's
do the.
To show the
jiggly line,
historical
the
volatility, yeah. It gives you some comfort that we're
Right,
going totally out to space.
yeah.
Although the next page
Line in there.
brings,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
Over the last 50 years, if we have all that data, I think we do. Chip will tell us almost.
Next slide. And so if we sum all of those years, if we do a running sum of all the years on the previous slide, 2022 through 2070, here's how they add up. The dotted gray line is not an actual sum of historic. It's a sum of the average historic each year, because again, we don't have these years historically. But if you ran the average historic out 50 years, it would go along that gray line. And so we see that the wet climate change scenario has the most inflow, cumulative, and the dry has the driest, the least inflow. And the wet is about even with what we've seen historically in terms of volumes.
So go back to say what, the gray line, the historical average, say again what that, it's not the actual, it's the average.
Yes, and that's why it's a straight line instead of the,
Right.
yeah.
Because the axis is representing years that have not occurred.
Right.
So to make a representation of what would likely occur if it stayed on the same trend, they just used the average and stacked it.
Okay.
So the very dry bookend is gonna get 2/3 of the water of the very wet.
That's right. And the wet, while we're calling it the wet, it's the wettest of the three scenarios, but it's not wetter than historic.
Drier.
Wettest of the three scenarios, but not historic. Got it.
Right, because
Right.
it matches up at
Right.
the 2070,
Right.
yeah, with the average historic.
Pretty darn close, that's amazing.
That is amazing.
So the wettest scenario is still gonna be drier than the last 50 years.
Gonna be about on par with the last 50 years, yeah.
I mean, it's close.
Right, yeah, yeah.
Not,
Yeah.
Right, and remember to take this in context of what they're showing, because we then have to, and which Jared's gonna get into, you then have to prepare demands, and when deliveries are made for demands, and when the reservoirs are filling up.
Yeah.
Okay,
So we have that variability.
right.
All right.
So, in addition to the differences in inflow, obviously with climate change, there's a different runoff patterns. And so what we've done here is for the three climate change scenarios and historic, we took the average of every January 1st, the average of every January 2nd, et cetera. So each of these lines has 365 points for the 365 days of the year.
is there a specific year? That was my other question about the
These are the average of all the years.
average of all the years.
Yeah, so again, the May 1st point is the average of all the May 1sts. And the June
Okay,
1st
that was-
point is the average of all the June
No,
1sts.
there was a correlation, okay.
And so in historic, here we're looking at the unimpaired middle Yuba at Milton.
Mhm.
In historic, what you see is that in the, say, November through March period, inflows are fairly low, because all that precipitation is actually coming in as snow and getting locked up in the hill. And then in about April through July, that snow is all melting, and it comes down in a large pulse of water. And what we see with these climate change scenarios is that precipitation is coming down as rain and is running down the hill. And that large snowmelt pulse is almost completely disappeared.
So it's almost 3 months or better earlier.
Yeah. And so again, even with that wet scenario where it's about the same volume as historic, you still have an impact due to this pattern shift. And then with the dry, you've got this pattern shift and you're losing volume.
Which means that we have to start drawing reservoirs down sooner in our irrigation season than we've historically done before,
Right.
which means the carryover becomes more problematic for us.
Then is it also true then that the reservoirs will fill later?
Bill?
They're filling earlier.
They're filling earlier.
Yeah.
And spilling.
Yeah.
It's just normally we have the snow reservoir
Sure.
that's draining before we have to start drawing ours down.
Got it.
This is suggesting to us that we're gonna have to draw them down sooner than we used to.
So earlier, we saw that historically, we have about 110,000 acre feet snowpack that melts off and then refills our reservoirs, and that was gonna drop down to 55,000 acre feet. But I think this says even more.
I didn't see what you're talking about. You said earlier.
Some months ago.
One of the-
Not earlier in the.
It was one of the first presentations.
Oh, okay.
So some months ago, we were gonna only get 55,000, and not only are we only get 55,000 acre feet, it's gonna come off much earlier.
So to answer that question, yeah, sorry. Yeah. So, that was the middle Yuba, and here, if we're looking at Canyon Creek at Bowman, you have some, we have some snowmelt periods. And so I would say that what we're seeing is it's different across different basins. And so I believe that those numbers you're referring to are probably the sum across all the basins.
melt 3 months earlier.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how different they are on these, three pages.
Yeah, and so,
What's happening there? Why do they look so different?
so here on the third one, you know, Bear River at Lake Combi, Bear River doesn't have as much of a snowpack.
Doesn't have.
Right.
In fact, very little. And, it's actually a little surprising that it's shifting earlier as much as it is, since it's a rain shed, although I think the answer is that the precipitation itself is shifting earlier.
Shifting or.
I have less of an answer on the difference between the first two. Told by the climate change team, it's just natural variability.
Okay.
Do you know at what elevation it's predicted where the snow line will occur? Obviously, as time evolves, it's gonna be higher and higher, but, I mean, are we talking about, you know, this is an average over 50 years, but it progresses as the climate warms.
Yes.
So, at what elevation are we talking about, under what timeline are we talking about that occurrence happening? I mean, it's not in whatever year, the first of the 50 years,
Right.
that it happens.
Yeah.
It's progressive. And I'm just trying to get a sense of, because it gives us an idea of the urgency and the immediacy of addressing the issues at hand and what capacity needs to be built over what time period.
So
Yeah. But,
that's not what the climate change modeling's showing you. It's not, we're not making a prediction about a specific year in which we're going to have a shortage.
Now, I realize that, that's obvious from the volatility of the data that's shown, but we are going to have a higher impact from climate change in 2070 versus 2030.
Yes.
And I'm just saying that that volatility, I just want to know, can you assess that volatility, or is it,
The study I read, or it came out 3 months ago or 2 months ago, the snow level is gonna rise 1,600 feet. And so that was gonna.
In our watershed?
In our watershed.
I'm gonna go ahead and pass that question along to the climate change team,
Yeah.
just a little bit closer to some of that data.
Actually, I don't have an exact number of where it's gonna raise.
Everybody's funny.
Yeah, Dave Curtis from West Consultants. I don't have an exact number in terms of elevation, how it's gonna raise. I know that right now, the biggest change has occurred below about 8,000 feet, which is most of the mountains in this area. And so as, it's just gonna creep up over the next 20, 30 years for sure. But I can't tell you exactly when. I mean, it could occur, it may lose the entire thing, just the way climate would work, in the next 30 years. It could be above the tops of the mountains, we don't know yet. Just with the natural variability, like Jennifer said, this is not a prediction per se of year by year by year exactly what it's gonna be, but you kind of have to kind of average all these different scenarios together to get a sense of how long it's gonna take.
Yeah,
Not an exact prediction.
the driest 3-year period could happen this decade, or it could not happen until the 4th decade of our 50-year planning horizon.
I realize that.
It's gotta be ready.
I'm just saying that, on average, I mean, climate is warming gradually over time, right? It's not going from here to here over, at least right now, historically happening.
Right.
And I'm just saying that as we look at planning for the future, it seems that understanding the breadth of time is important in terms of the investments and the infrastructure that needs to be built. In other words, we don't have to build Rome in a day. We can take some amount of time to build that infrastructure that is predictive of the future.
I think until it's built, you're taking a risk. I mean, it's naturally baked into how long it takes to build water infrastructure.
Right, and finance it.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just talking. I just feel like this is a chance to explore what the data is showing us, not just march through it as if I'm just gonna go, okay, yeah, sounds good. So these are my questions.
Just point out that the data,
In the microphone, please,
Christiana,
so we can hear.
again, with West Consultants. I just would like to point out that we could potentially calculate that with the data, but it's gonna be wrong. You know, like, we could calculate an average, but it's almost dangerous to give that number,
Sure.
because it would make people assume that that's what's gonna happen. And that's why we are so reluctant to put that trend line there and say, that's when it's gonna happen, because it's really not the way it works, as Jennifer pointed out.
No, I do not mean to imply that I think any model, we've talked about this at every meeting, the model is a model that is predictive but not indicative of what is going to happen. So I get that, that is very clear. But the fact of the matter is, we're gonna have to make big investments based on, and if we want to assume, okay, in 5 years, we'll be where we are, that's a decision we could make. But is that the decision we want to make?
No, good
It
point.
has to be done now.
Good.
Well, from the perspective of how long it takes for large infrastructure projects, something needs to be in the works as far as addressing whatever strategy alternative. Because that worst dry year 3-year period could happen in the next 5 years. Because if you think back to 2021, what we saw, remember, it was 2021, when we had not that much runoff
Right.
because the snow melted so early. So that's when you start looking at that pattern, and that happens year after year, that's when you get into trouble.
Yeah.
I'll look for that article,
Okay,
because
cool.
I thought it was a government article.
Thank you.
What's getting worrisome is that if you look at some of the recent observations about how temperature globally has changed,
Right.
September was off the charts in terms of a leap upwards in terms of how warm it's gotten. So that's the troublesome part. It's
Yeah.
happening faster than we can think. So we could give you an average that might not seem to be critical for another 15 or 20 years, but how fast things have changed in the last couple of years, that's kind of a worrisome spot. I mean, off the coast of Florida, they observed 100-degree temperatures in the water.
Right.
And that has a huge impact worldwide. So anyway,
How come they
Thank
get a
you.
hot tub?
your concern is noted. You're spot on in terms of the thinking, to manage the risk going forward and making those big decisions. It's just a difficult one to give you a number.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
So, in addition to those projected climate change inflows, we've got these projected demands from the irrigation demand calculator. They gave us a set of high demands, baseline demands, and low demands. And each of the climate change scenarios, those precipitation patterns were overlaid on those, ET demands to get an irrigation demand. And so that's why, for any given climate change scenario, the demand varies a little bit, even with a demand set, because those high baseline and low are, again, the total ETO demands, and then what we're putting into the model are the irrigation demands that are net of precipitation.
Can you describe what low demand would look like?
I could not, but I bet that somebody on the IT.
I
Low
forgot it.
demand,
Yeah,
the low demand was a 20% reduction
off the top,
of
Yeah,
the current,
off the top.
yeah.
That's what we're talking, it's
Yeah.
basically rationing.
Yeah, or
Combination.
it could be
It
a
could be
combination.
anything.
It was an arbitrary number to show if you were to reduce demands by 20%.
Yeah.
20%.
And 20% was the figure we used,
Yeah.
Correct. That was
Whereas-
that low demand scenario.
whereas it could be a lot larger. I mean,
Well,
think
there's
California.
there's other representations of larger demand here. There's median and there's high demand. So can I follow up on your question?
Sure.
So I'm curious, in the high demand scenario, the soft serve areas were considered 100% build out, 50%?
No.
And how did you,
Remember, that was all part of that analysis.
I know
on
it
the
was, but
side.
I'm not remembering.
Yeah.
So what we did is we looked at, for the meeting, we looked at basically using historic growth that we've seen and continuing that into our future demand growth, which I think was 20 acres for raw and 50 acres for treated. And then on the high demand, we took 1.5 times our historic rate. So that was like, so it came up to be 40 acres.
30
raw,
acres.
30 acres, sorry, 30 acres.
Developed land.
Okay, I thought there was some calculations of
So
soft
it
surface
uses
area.
that to fill in in the soft surface area, but we didn't just say 100% of soft surface is filled. It's based on the rate of either being currently historic or actually increasing it by the 1.5%, or 1.5 times.
Yeah, the soft service area is simply used to identify specific parcels within the soft service area that have a high likelihood of getting connected, so then they can go and overlay the land data so they can determine the ET, so then they can assign a water use to it. It wasn't just this connection of soft service areas, it was more sophisticated than that.
And
Otherwise, you wouldn't have a chance to be able to identify which ET would apply to it
Right.
for it to
Yeah.
have a
And they also
volume.
looked at the planning documents and
Right.
stuff too, right? So
Because there's also a treated water demand.
Yeah, there
Yeah,
was.
Right.
but treated water really doesn't move the needle.
So during the low demand, it was just a 20%, cut from the state. Our actual demand for water was higher.
No, the 20% was not,
Well, it was a voluntary one, right? But the state said, come in, you have to conserve 20%.
yeah, as part of the
treated
water.
water, but not the raw water
Ooh.
end of it, but we asked for a voluntary reduction.
So this 20% demand is a theoretical percentage applied to the
Okay.
current baseline. What you're talking about is when there's emergency drought regulations that require a specific percentage of reduction. And yes, they do typically apply to treated water. But there has been a more recent effort by the state through additional regulations for development of water budgets for outdoor water irrigation. And those are a little bit different.
So 20% may be not enough as a bookend.
Well, there's a lot of different things going on right now that I think for the purposes of this effort, I think that bookend is just fine. There's some additional regulations that have recently come out associated with the ongoing update to the Bay Delta Basin Plan that has a component of unimpaired flow as one of the alternatives required in the analysis. That unimpaired flow standard would require a greater reduction than 20%. But for the purpose of this process, I think that these are really good bookends to continue to move forward with. Yeah. I mean, to give you an idea, right, I don't know that I'd ever plan for the highest demand or the lowest demand. I'm more of a kind of a baseline gal.
but remember, it also considers the ET and stuff, right? So
Right.
it's still,
Right.
even though we reduce the demand from current by 20%, there's still changes in those demands
Yes.
based on the information related to the climate model, et cetera, right? So,
Yeah, that is the only part of climate change that's included in the demand is the modification of ET. Otherwise, you know, the climate change model is its own scenario.
Thank you.
So moving forward, just remember that the baseline demands are about roughly equal to what, you know, we've done in the recent past. So with those climate change scenarios and those demand scenarios, we developed 10 modeling scenarios that are just a matrix where we mixed up those three to get 9. And then there's this 10th run that has a slightly different purpose, but it's extremely similar to number 5. So we developed these 10 baseline scenarios. So all of these scenarios, we have different demand inputs, we have different climate change inputs, and we ran it through the reservoir operations model with business as usual, the way you've been operating over the last 10 years. There's been no adjustment to adapt to these different climate inputs.
Does the data include our PG&E purchases or not?
No.
No.
Well, using their water?
That's
a good question.
The unmet demands don't.
right.
So the PG&E water is included as far as in the old model that was used for the FERC relicensing. The distribution of water within the shared system was shown in kind of an offshoot spreadsheet that everyone referred to as the red and blue spreadsheet. That is now incorporated into the reservoir operations model, but these unmet demand scenarios do not rely on that particular water source because it would also essentially be impacted in the same manner in which
Right.
ours would be.
Right, that makes sense.
It's the same watershed.
So, is the water storage data included or not included?
It includes it as far as how the systems it moves through that are shared.
But not in terms of our water, the water we have the ability to distribute.
It is not offsetting the unmet demand.
Okay, let me ask a different way. We buy PG&E water.
Not all the time.
Not all the time.
Well, let's just say,
We could.
we could.
We could.
Yeah, but we buy it once,
Well,
2 times a decade?
well, I guess we can say
No, we
that it's
purchased
not
it.
included. Because by your response, it would say it's not reflected in this because it's not predictable, right? We don't know if PG&E water would be available.
That's right.
We don't know
Right.
if we could,
We need
if we needed it,
don't
we
need
would
to
buy
need
it,
it.
so it's not part of
Yes.
the scenario.
It is not offsetting the unmet demand.
Or storage carry forward, or anything.
No, it is addressed in all of the storage analysis in the reservoir operations model because it is inherently included because we share a lot of those facilities.
But it's not our water.
It's accounted for, but we don't take it as our own.
Yeah. So the model allows for PG&E water that has the first, whatever, 300 or some certain amount of flow in the Bear River. That gets passed in the model that we can't collect.
Right.
So it's identified in there
Mhm.
as water that's not available to us.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah, I guess
Storage and that stuff.
I'll add that, like Doug said, PG&E gets the first 300 CFS coming down the Bear River, but they have a small storage account in Rollins, and when that storage account is full, we do have the model abandoning that water to NID. And so,
And that's a valid point. We do pick up water that they are not using. And that's addressed in this. Because also think about it, maybe from this perspective, the purchasing of PG&E water is always, always could be a strategy depending on the year,
Right.
depending on how it's available to address unmet demands from our own supply.
Yeah.
So,
If we budget for it, yes.
Yes.
back to that point about we pick up water that they are filling or using,
yes, they're unable to store.
unable to store.
Yeah, they run out of storage at some point, and they borrow storage in Rollins up to 10,000 acre feet unless we let them borrow more because we don't need it.
How does that figure in our water rights and their water rights?
That's why we have Tor, who has a really big brain and keeps it all straight.
Because that's a good point. Now is that free water that we can just sell, that we accumulate and can sell? No.
Wait, no.
But we can make.
I think we're overly complicating this,
All right,
yeah.
Don't complicate that.
That system gets really complicated, and our rights to that water are limited by the existing coordinated operating agreement. We have a right to purchase water from PG&E. It is managed, it has to be managed through our water rights.
Right.
Tor and Chip spend a lot of time managing that water with PG&E. And then what do you talk to them, twice a week, once a week? It's a lot of effort.
Weekly. It is weekly.
Yeah, but the unmet demands shown in this presentation do not include any offset from purchasing that water.
Okay.
Got it.
That's
Thank
good
you.
to know.
Very good.
So, again, we used these inputs, we performed 10 studies, business as usual operations, and then we went and looked at the challenges with operating the system with those demands and climate change scenarios. After we look at these results, we are going to select we're going to suggest selecting 3 of these to move forward for additional analysis.
One of each.
Whatever we
Whatever.
decide.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could comment, so I'm looking at, call it the high and dry,
Yep.
scenario 1. Do you have a way of looking at what is the probability of that?
Right.
It seems to me it's improbable.
So,
In one of your other graphs, it talks about, only 20% of the time. Anyway, I'll stop right there.
yeah, so
Answer.
on the climate side of things,
Uh-huh.
my understanding is that one is not more probable than the other.
No. Okay.
On the demand side of things, you have a little bit more control over that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one could say that in the really dry climate scenario, are you gonna let demands increase that much?
No. I mean,
Right,
I would think not.
right.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. So that's why, so I look at, I think back to Trevor's comments about spending time and effort on these 2, and that being one of them, that it's so improbable that we probably don't want to look at that, or do we?
The benefit, in my opinion, from looking at that, so Jared said one thing that was really important. Not one of those scenarios, the climate scenarios, has a higher probability than the other of occurring. So it's not like the median scenario is the middle probability scenario. It's just the middle precipitation inflow scenario. From the perspective, and I think what Dave said earlier, just a few minutes ago, and I know him and I've had this conversation, is really important. So what we've known about climate change has changed drastically over the past decade, and then over the last 5 years, and then now we're seeing conditions we haven't ever seen before, even in the last 2 years.
Right.
For me, the bookends on the high and the low side, the 1 and the 9, they really tell, it's like the canary in the coal mine.
Yes.
Like, things are really bad. We're exceeding even what we thought was gonna be our worst case, and I think that's important to understand. Not that I advocate for planning for the worst case Armageddon, because you couldn't afford it, and I don't,
Right.
to what end, but I think it's they're good numbers to know, good bookends to understand if they exceed.
Figuring out probabilities.
No, and that's why, and Jared will get to it, but that's what the exceedance graphs are intended to help you understand the percentage of time we think any specific unmet demand would actually occur.
Okay, those were helpful too, by the way. Okay.
So with those 9 runs, we're gonna look at unmet demands, we're gonna look at carryover storage, and we're not gonna look at it today, but we looked at minimum flow requirements. All minimum flow requirements are met in all the scenarios, and that's because we sacrifice reservoir storage to make sure that that's happening. Minimum flows are basically the highest priority in the model, and that's why they get met.
That's the.
To where-
Right?
Yeah,
That was the
Proposed flow.
new FERC flows.
that's correct.
Yeah, the proposed ones.
So we have current minimum flow requirements
Right.
related to our current licenses, and then we have the not yet issued FERC license, which has the ones that were previously negotiated. Those are included in the reservoir operations.
Okay,
Mhm.
good to know.
That was my question.
Yes.
Yeah,
We ask at every meeting, don't we?
I know.
Question every meeting.
Yeah, just always think about, in-stream flows are not in the demand model, they're handled in the reservoir
Right.
operations model.
During the stakeholder group, request to consider reduced reservoir carryover targets during dry periods. Is that where we talk about it now?
You could talk about it anytime you want. That was a request from, Chris Schutz from the stakeholder group, and essentially, and Chris, I think you're on, chime in if you would like to. Basically, and there was an additional slide that was added, wasn't there?
Yeah, but I think that could be something you talk about in the next steps in the potential analysis. To
Yeah.
look at how, like he says, we are operating as though we currently operate now. But one of the things that we can consider is reducing carryover storage, reoperating our reservoirs, that kind of stuff, is a way to help meet the unmet demand scenarios
Right.
that we can run through the
For
model.
the current year, but nothing saving less for the coming years.
It's a risk.
Right, it's a gamble.
It's all a gamble,
It's
yeah.
a-
Whether you want to change that number or.
Yeah, some of our challenges is we don't have a secondary water supply such as groundwater. So, if we took a bad risk, and we've been close to running carryover storage lower in past years to deal with drought.
Yeah, we did, in that year,
We went to 111.
yeah, we went down, when we thought we had the big snowpack, but we didn't. I mean, it was there, but it didn't run off.
Right.
It went in.
21?
Yeah, I think it was 21, was it?
Yeah.
78,000 is where we hit public health and safety,
Mhm.
and 111 is the lowest we've gone, or 106, right in that area.
Lower, just not in the recent history.
My recent history.
That makes you,
I can only remember so many
does
years.
that make you young? Does that make you young?
Why not?
Yeah.
So we're gonna talk about that.
Yeah,
Coming up.
let's talk about that in the alternate strategies analysis.
You got it.
So, average annual unmet demands. As expected, the drier climate change scenarios have more unmet demands, and the higher demand scenarios have more unmet demands. We've got a gray line there showing what the average has been historically. And even with the lower demands, because of the shift in runoff patterns, you still see unmet demands that are at or higher than what you've seen historically.
Mhm.
And again, that's because, as Doug said, we're starting to pull down the reservoirs, a couple months earlier. Got the median unmet demands. Historically, the median has been 0, because you have 0 unmet demands in at least half the years. In a lot of these, that doesn't actually, your median isn't that you're different than your average, but in some scenarios it is.
May I ask, what, and I asked you this, but I need to ask again for me and for anyone who
Sure.
might be wondering. So in this, scenario with the high baseline and low, and this is for the median unmet demand, what is the assumption of the years just prior to that? Is there an assumption that we have full storage? Was there a medium dry year before that? I mean, it seems like what had happened before, when this begins, is relevant.
Yeah, and so, the hydrology that we're using here is essentially random in terms of what one year follows the next year. And so we've got a mix of, a dry after a dry after a critically dry, a dry after a wet. And we took all the 1 year, whatever preceded it, ranked them, and took the median.
So it's not looking at like reservoir storage, it's looking at just the,
Well, that's what I was trying to get at is, so, you got in these demand models, what were the years preceding, and what I hear you saying is you took a median.
it does.
Yeah, and so for each of these bars, we could go look at what the year preceding it was.
Uh-huh.
It probably would be a different answer for everyone, right? In other words, what type of year, what type of storage conditions you came into it with.
Modeling medium works. Well,
It-
thing.
Sure, I mean, it's just another data point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I was curious, thank you.
And so to get into a little bit more detail, we made these exceedance curves. And so here we're looking at the high demand scenarios for the 3 different climate scenarios. And as you see with these high demands, you're getting unmet demands in 80 to 90% of years. You're getting magnitudes of unmet demands higher than anything you've seen historically. And so essentially, we took the unmet demands in every year of the 2021 through 2070 period, we ranked them. And so here, for instance, for the green line at 60%, we're saying that 60% of the years had an unmet demand of 10,000 or higher,
10,000 or higher.
right? And 60% of the years with the dry hydrology had 40,000 or higher, 30,000 and higher.
Is another way to look at it that 80% of the years in the median hydrology high demand is 80% of the years you had no exceed.
We had,
So you met demands 80% of the time, is that correct?
no, we met demands 20% of the time.
Right.
And
See where
80%,
Flatlined at basically 80% there in the green.
Yeah,
Right.
So what it's saying is that last 20% is where we actually met all our demands, but that first
oh, I thought
80%
inversely.
I did too.
Okay.
is,
You did, okay.
didn't.
Okay.
yeah, these are not deliveries, these are the unmet demands.
So then, to restate it, because I was seeing this completely reversed. So what you're saying then is for the dry, the orange arrows or orange triangles, that 20% of the time, we would have a shortfall of roughly 70,000 acre feet. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
In that scenario, okay. And then conversely, down here in the historic hydrology, 20% of the time, we'd have, under 20,000 acre feet. Okay, I had thought really, Chris, just like you, I thought completely the opposite.
So,
I've not
is
understood
it
the
our,
chart yet.
is it our job to say where we're gonna land on this?
No.
No. Okay.
In other words,
I mean,
you don't get to select, right?
Yeah, right.
In a year, you might land anywhere on it.
God, is
Right.
Not God.
In that scenario.
I think it
Right.
helps you to ultimately make the decision on where you want to go in the range of planning, is to look at these types of things and
Yes,
say,
yes.
is it reasonable to consider number one as the dry and the highest demand when, the exceedance is showing? It's just showing you these different options. I hope you figure out what you think works best for the district.
and that's my
on how we
point
move
was,
forward.
do we wanna be at 50%, we're gonna be somewhere, short 30 to
Remember, these are
40,000
only
acre
the
feet.
first three scenarios. There's two other slides that have the other scenarios.
Right.
We split them out, it was
Those are
just too
all-
crowded.
Yeah, so for instance, the orange line is one scenario, the blue line is another scenario. So you're selecting either the orange line with all of that distribution of unmet demands, or the blue line with all that distribution of unmet demands.
Okay.
And so if we move on to the baseline demands, you're still seeing a high percentage of years that have some unmet demands. The magnitude of those unmet demands has come down. You're roughly within the range of what you've seen historically, just happening a lot more often.
Well, so then I have to follow up. So then this is historic recent demands, and we're showing here in your graph that we have had unmet demands in the past.
Well,
Is that what this is saying?
let's be a little bit more specific there. We're taking historic hydrology,
Yes.
so the reservoir inflows that you have seen historically, and recent demands, and running that through historic hydrology. So for instance, that highest gray dot
Yes.
there, that's 1977. In 1977, your demands were a lot lower. So you didn't have unmet demands anywhere near that high.
Mhm.
But we're saying that if the 1977 hydrology happened again with these demands, you very well might.
That's what you're saying. Okay. That was not, I didn't catch all of that from,
Yeah.
I was going through this 5 times.
Yeah.
10 times.
So, for instance, another one of the really high ones is 1988. Back in 1988, you had, 88, you had lower demands, but both 77 and 88 were a critical dry following a critical dry. And if that were to happen again with these demands, then that's something you might expect in terms of unmet demands.
So, because then I would turn to Chip and say, well, has there ever been a time when we've not met our demand? And I think the answer is no.
Okay, no, the one thing that also you might want to reflect upon is you're talking about what we've already experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is projecting out future with new
No, I
Right.
get that, but when it looks,
there were shortages in 1977.
oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
but the point being is that,
this gray line says that, there was a point in time when we had a 40,000 acre feet,
no, what it's saying is that in the last, in 76, I think it is, if you took basically today's demands and you ran that day's demands over the last 30 years, if we had today's demands in 1977, we would have been way short. But back in 1977, we didn't have the same demand that we have today.
Did we have the same supply? Did we have the same?
Back in
Yeah,
76,
basically
yeah.
almost all the same reservoirs.
It's all the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
Just
So-
curious.
Yeah, so what it's just saying is that, looking forward, looking back, if you have today's demands and you look at the history, there are probabilities, again, that's relatively small because it was basically one extreme event that we had,
Mhm.
the first couple. There is the chance for that to happen, that's what would happen.
Okay.
If 1976 happens next year, we're gonna have a huge deficit. If it lays out the same way that we did
And
76.
each one of those scenarios shows that, different amounts, but shows that.
Yeah.
And this also shows that with the historic, that 20% of the time, we had a shortfall of 20,000 acre feet.
We would potentially have that shortfall.
With that future
With
demand.
today's demand.
With today's
Today's
demand
demand.
and the
Got it.
new
And
in-stream
the
flow
old-
requirements.
Old hydrology, today's demand.
That's just the PERC
20%
requirements.
Right.
probability
That's
chance
not-
that we would hit that scenario. Yeah.
It's basically showing you what would happen if climate change were not occurring. If you
Right.
made the assumption that past hydrology is your baseline.
Predictor.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is all about PERC and not, okay. Gotcha.
And so, yeah, it's, current demands and future FERC flows.
Got it, okay. Thank you.
And so then, we've got the, low demand scenarios, which on the left-hand side of the graph are generally comparable to what you would have gotten with historic hydrology. Some of those low unmet demand years, which are likely a 10% reduction from your drought contingency plan, they would happen more often than what you've seen with historic hydrology, again, just because of the runoff patterns. So now, for each of the 9 scenarios, we've got a graph showing what the worst 3-year consecutive drought that we're seeing is. And so we totaled up every 3 years, so, 2021 through 2023, 2022 through 2024, 2023 through 2025, and picked the largest of those 3-year sums, and we're graphing those 3 years individually.
They were consecutive?
Consecutive,
Yeah, so they weren't picked out,
correct.
okay. So this has actually happened.
The driest 3 years within the projection, and they're gonna vary in terms of when they happen, so that's why there's no specific year as to, it's gonna happen in year 25, 26, 27. It could just as easily happen in year 55, 56, 57, right? I think.
Yeah, this is not predictive.
It's not predictive. What it's trying to tell you is that in a 3 driest year scenario, and each of these are the deficits you're gonna see for the unmet demand number. That's what it's trying to.
So if the drought's 2 years, it's something less likely.
Right.
4 years, it's likely something
Right.
more. This just gives you an idea.
And we know that there may be 3 consecutive years where it's incredibly wet. So it's not gonna be that same, right? Even in the dry scenario number 1, we may have a section where you've got plenty of water for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years in a row. So it's not like this, it's just trying to identify that this would be a potential worst-case scenario, 3-year scenario, and overall projection.
And the state of California requires us to plan for this.
Yeah,
Is it 3 years on the
Like
urban
5.
water management plan, or is it 5?
I thought it
Five.
was 5. Yeah.
5.
So we have, actually, it gets worse. Or better.
There's not real clear criteria on how you get those 3 and 5 year deals with regards to that state requirement, so. I'm not necessarily saying that this would be the correct way to go about that,
Gotcha.
but they would require.
Okay.
I have, a question. So, looking back on, the notes section, okay? And I'm looking at, the corresponding notes to this slide, which is on page 7 of our presentation. And it is slide 19 is what is showing, okay? And so am I right, let's just make sure that I'm matching up the right.
So you're, this slide?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, so slide 19 matches up, I mean, the notes for slide 19 matches this slide.
Correct.
I just wanted to start with that, okay.
Yes.
Just to make sure I got it all, that part correct. And so then in the notes, it says, total unmet demand over the worst 3-year period is more than 225,000 acre feet. Now, when I asked you about that, you said that was a typo.
We're, not that slide. You're talking about the next one.
The next one.
Yeah,
So
the
those are
next
just-
one,
Yeah, the next one.
Okay.
slide 20, unmet demands, which is the next slide.
Okay,
That's just a total of the cumulative of those three. So if you
Yeah.
add those three up, it's roughly 225,000 acre feet.
225,000 acre feet is correct if you're taking this slide into consideration. It's the next slide that has a typo.
oh, okay, because that's why I also asked. And then does that unmet demand also, consider, you know, in the 225,000 acre feet, does that include or take into account carryover storage and how we operate the system and all of those kinds of things?
How we currently operate.
Right.
How we currently are?
They're hard and fast rules, so it's not showing, that doesn't show in a 3 dry year period, these unmet demands. Chip and Tor trying to maximize the system, or we lower carryover storage 1 year. This is just goes by the hard and fast rules of what our carryover storage is and some of the reservoir operation rules.
Okay, so then in slide 20 is the number of 250 is where we said
Yeah.
had a typo.
Yes,
What should that be?
it's 170,
170. Well, the next two, actually, 170.
Yeah.
yeah.
I think what's good is when you look at these two, like this particular scenario, it's not that the amount of unmet demand continues to climb every year, because in that 3rd year, there's probably more water in the system when it was modeled, which is why the 3rd year demand met is actually less than the second. The second is actually the worst of the 3.
Yeah, I noticed that in a lot
Yeah,
of these.
it's because the climate model is suggesting there's more runoff, there's more water coming into space, and therefore, our unmet demand is actually
Okay,
less.
that makes sense.
And this is also one, you know, this is one thing we've gently brought up, we haven't moved forward with it a whole lot, is that with those new in-stream flows for the FERC relicensing effort, if we were able to alleviate some of the wet year flows and able to store more, it would mellow some of this out, right? Because we'd start with higher
Because
carryover.
they go up to 59,600 acre
Yeah.
feet, thereabouts,
Yeah.
and that's where it kills us.
Yeah, from a financial perspective, this is really challenging for a district of our size to absorb the revenue loss as well as the hydropower, because you get hit on the water rate revenue side and on the hydropower side.
Yeah.
Would we not be able to go to FERC and get some kind of,
We have to renegotiate it.
well, I know the PCWA goes and annually, right? Or every year and says, okay, we need a variance to the flows or something. Isn't there something that happens?
I don't think so, no.
No?
I think you're maybe referring
Maybe
to some of their water forum agreements, which is a
Maybe
settlement
I'm
for
mixing
other
up.
flows. I think it might be that.
Okay.
So, again, with this dry climate, high demand, it's, just 3 completely devastating years in a row.
Right.
I think that this goes a little bit towards that, carrying over differently, right? Here in year 2, if you decided to pull your reservoirs down a little bit more to squeeze more water out of the system, you're just pushing those deficiencies into year 3, right?
And Trevor, Director Calder is home ill, but he is watching, and his comment is, this is where a probability would be helpful. How often will a 3 dry year scenario occur?
Right. You know,
That's where you have to go to the exceedance charts, right?
yeah.
Right.
Well, and, by definition, we had 50 years, and this is the worst one, so 2%.
There you go.
What's the percent?
2.
2% is
Yeah, but
the
it-
probability for this scenario. Is that,
Yeah.
did I just hear you say that?
3 years out of 50 would be 6%.
But this 3-year sequence only happened once. Yeah.
This is the worst
But it
three-year
just
sequence.
happened, right?
Well,
It's just 3 years.
Yeah, I mean,
we just had
Yeah.
our worst three-year period, which
Ever.
which goes to just speak to what we don't know about climate change, so.
Yes. Okay.
so scenario 2, median climate, high demand,
Mhm.
still 3 terrible years in a row, 3 terrible years. Wet climate, high demand. Again, the mix of the 3 years is a little bit random. We're just total volume over the 3. Dry climate baseline demand, still be looking at 3 years in a row of 50,000 or more. Median climate baseline demand. Wet climate baseline demand. Dry climate low demand. As we get into our low demand, it starts getting a little bit better. Median climate low demand. This one is interesting. It turns out that the sum of just year 1 and year 3 are higher than any other 3-year sum in this particular scenario.
I wondered.
Well, remember, the low demand scenario includes 20% taken off the top of the demand.
Right.
And then the wet climate, low demand. So,
Can you help me understand?
sure.
How can it occur that in a median climate, low demand, you have more unmet demand when you have a median climate, you have.
Go ahead, try to say what I'm thinking,
Are
okay?
you guys just as confused as we are?
I guess this is just what the model is saying occurs, not making it's saying the 3 worst drought years, if you have these different climate and demand scenarios, this is just what it shows.
And they're not happening at the same time in the model.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's also part of the confusion. You're thinking, well, why would it be different on the same
Mhm.
window of time? But you're not. Each one is in a different location.
Yeah.
And it can have just more volatility, in the wet year scenario, it could just have more volatility than in the median scenario. Highs could be higher and the lows lower.
I'll also point out that with the climate change data sets that we happen to have, the median climate rainfall during the irrigation season is more than in the wet climate scenario. So that explains a little bit of the unmet demand intricacies that we're seeing.
Okay, yeah.
But then wet has more precipitation outside of the irrigation season. Yeah.
Rains more during irrigation, people water less.
Yeah.
And we're relying on storage less.
So we also took a look at November 1 carryover storage. Carryover storage is a lot more influenced by demand than by climate change with the way we're running the model. I'll note that at Jackson Meadows, we're generally doing the same carryover just about every year. And the drier the year, the less water we squeeze out of Jackson Meadows before hitting that carryover, but it doesn't really change your carryover all that much. Ditto, the way we're operating Bowman Lake, then Rollins and Scotts Flat are a lot more affected by your demands and your climate change.
Can we go back one slide?
Sure.
So in these scenarios what is the assumption about the carry forward storage going into that period? So it's saying there's unmet demand based on what carry forward storage going into that drought period?
Yeah, so, I'll say that at Jackson Meadows, we are using the same carryover every year, and we got advice from your operators that it's about 50% at the end of the year.
Okay.
Bowman, same thing. At Rollins, we've got water coming in, and Rollins is generally full until about, early and midsummer. And then, depending on the exact hydrology of that year, Rollins storage will start to come down at a different time, depending on when your runoff trails off. And so in your drier years or your earlier runoff years, Rollins is gonna come down further before the rain finally comes and relieves Rollins and lets it fill again.
Okay, thank you, sorry.
So carryover storage, point out again that the low demands bring you back to kind of the average historic, because we've got those runoff patterns, right? And so using your recent historic demands with the climate change runoff, you're carrying over lower. And wanted to look at those carryover storages in a little bit more detail. Here we're looking at the high demand scenarios. You'll see that the slope of those lines is generally the same as historic. It's just brought down by about 40,000 acre feet. The three dots all the way on the left are an October storm that fills up the reservoirs right before we take our snapshot.
So, is that saying about 20% of the time, or we're gonna be right at public health and safety levels?
Depending on what scenario you're talking about, it looks like it's just under 120, so it's actually higher than that. Oh, you're talking about at the bottom end here?
Yeah,
It looks like it's even less than that.
just right above
Roughly
our
about
public health
80,000,
and
yeah,
safety
it's a
level.
little past 20% of the time.
So, and can you give me what happens then? I mean, then it goes just to treated water customers, and then does the
Well, it's per the water code.
animal, livestock, perennial, and annual crops?
Yeah, the water code has a priority based off of those categories, and health and safety is first.
Right, and then the governor added golf courses in 2014.
Right, but if there's that bad of a drought, right, you're also gonna get emergency regulations and those
Right.
kinds of things, so.
And I will note that those health and safety levels are not in the model. Those health and safety levels are not included in the model. The model's not watching out for those reservoir levels.
They're not, I didn't hear that, I'm sorry.
It's not a rule in the model that says you must hold the reservoir to this health and safety
No,
standard.
it's our
Yeah.
It's our internal,
internal level. Gotcha, yeah. But that's what we've designated as our public health and safety level that we need to have.
Can you reflect on what creates from 40% to really 90%? Those lines are tracking almost on top of each other. And yet, one is a dry hydrology, one is median, and one is wet. Why is there no difference in storage?
Well, your demand numbers are staying the same.
Right.
Right? So
But you have more inflow.
But generally, the reservoirs are operating, trying to get to a level, and so I'd say that from 40 to 85, 90, they're able to get to the normal level they want to get to. And then on the drier side, they can't maintain that, and on the wetter side, you get some inflows that are bringing them up, or inflows were high enough that they weren't even able to really draw down to the level that.
And remember, on those graphs, we looked at the first one, there were years of high and years of
Sure.
low even for each one, right? So
Right.
that's kind of all being reflected in.
And aren't we also putting in there that we're not able to store later like we are with the snowpack, that would be melting earlier? So we wouldn't be able to store that, water we normally.
Yeah, the inflow peak happens earlier in the year as opposed to later in the year.
Yeah.
So what we have as of April 15th is what we're gonna get.
That's what that one table is showing you.
Yeah.
Maybe I got, maybe I can help with that, because, another way to look at it is that we have a finite amount of storage forever, right? So number of reservoirs, so they can't hold anymore, right?
That's true.
So that's why to me, that's why that overlay shows that they're all the same, because there's no additional storage.
Also, if you look at just how Rollins and Combi
Yes.
act every year, they start spilling early every year, which means they're full.
They do. So they're not gonna add more.
And that demand ultimately has a big play in this, right? When he shows you the next year is gonna be a median demand, and then at the low demand, and what you see is those numbers are even closer together.
Yeah.
Even though you still have a lot of changes in terms of inflows from different hydrology.
So at the baseline demand, getting closer to the kind of historic trend, and again, they're pretty close together. We have the same three climate scenarios, and so we still have, our 2 October storms all the way on the left. And then if we move to the low demand, just like we saw in that average graph, at the lower demands, you're able to stick to, generally where the carryover was historically.
Still doesn't mean that we've met our demands either, right? It's just stating that we're meeting our carryover storage, but as you saw in the previous slides, we are still not meeting demands at various levels, unmet demands, as a result of what's happening in the field. We have less demand overall, means we can fill our reservoirs back more often, but we still have times where we have unmet demands, even when our reservoirs reach carryover.
And you could always adjust carryover storage, but.
We have control.
Right, but you're taking, you don't want to plan on that.
Correct.
Right, you're just taking a risk.
Yeah.
Right.
It could be a big risk, or it could be a small risk. In reality, if we were hitting into, the third year of a major drought, we would start looking at reducing carryover storage.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I guess, I don't know if this is tying into the second request, but in evaluating these, I would like to almost see, low, medium, high for each one of these. So I could say, okay, we had a low demand and it's dry, then this is what's happening, or is there a way to do that, so we could evaluate them, or?
They're all on there.
Here.
So all three of these slides, we just separated it out because it was too busy of a
Too busy on
graph.
paper, yeah.
I guess I wanted to put them back together.
We still have that, so we can send it to you, yeah.
Well, and not all of these, but here's average, low, high, medium, high, here's,
We could
low
get
demand, here's high demand.
We could just put them all back on there.
We get overhead projector.
We have the slide, it was just too much to look at.
It was.
You couldn't see what was what.
Yeah,
No, I
right.
agree with you, but if you just had just
It's a little harder
low,
to compare.
medium, high for the
Mhm.
dry of the wet, I don't know, it'd be nice to evaluate it, but I think I could do it. Midnight, but that's okay.
Can you hand draw it?
Yeah.
with that, again, we want to select 3 studies and carry those forward to model potential strategic alternatives. Here, we've got some examples of the more likely ones. But that is a discussion to be had.
Seems like that we should have something on watershed, because investment in watershed health
Right.
results in more flow into the system. But I don't see that here.
I don't,
I made the same note.
Reforestation, restoration.
no, you're correct, I don't know that it lends itself to modeling. So remember at the beginning when I said there will be some strategic alternative analysis that is not physically modeled versus.
I do remember you saying that.
And NASA is working on some data. Greg and NASA and I have had a conversation, because there is some watershed benefit to meadow restorations and some of those things. So we will,
Have enough data on that.
we're gonna appear to quantify it, but also, just to report, we've been talking with Circle about coordinating some of our monitoring efforts, so we're collecting some of the same type of data, so we can get some more real tangible data on the benefits from a water supply perspective, as opposed to just water quality.
And then you could take that information, we assume some 10,000 acre feet, or whatever the number is.
Right.
You can then take that and look at the scenarios that we want to move forward with, and see how that changes it. Basically, we're just adding another 10,000 acre feet of.
We're just adding more in the supply, on the
Yeah,
supply side.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, when we get to the strategic alternatives position, we need to look at it in terms of cost benefit as well.
Yeah, that's all part of it.
Well, for all of the
For
strategic.
all of these, but yeah, you could put a forest management, meadow restoration as a big bullet point in this, and it could be part of the package. And
Well, and
that's
I think
of
it's part of a holistic approach is what the district's going to have to
It's a
embrace.
tool that we,
I just would appreciate it if it was.
Yeah, I would too.
So these, we're looking at scenarios for additional model runs. So there
So
wasn't,
that, you're saying that can't be modeled at this point in.
we're more of a literature research point.
Uh-huh.
But we can address it at some time.
Yeah, and we can just add, it is an alternative, we just don't have, we're talking about just for the modeling runs, but we can clarify that.
When we voted to take out Van Norden at the planning commission, it was noted that it was gonna raise the level of the stream by about 1 foot for a while, and then it was gonna drop back down after the spring runoff. And then, Circle's doing the work there, and they may have some numbers on how much it's contributing.
They don't, we just reached out yet, that was what I was referencing,
Jennifer,
Jordan. They don't have,
we're coordinating with them
Yeah.
on those numbers versus our numbers at English Meadow that we're gonna see. And so that we're talking apples to apples across the watershed, and hopefully it correlates in some fashion.
and there's a number of meadow restoration projects going on with the different agencies. I believe PCWA is doing one as well. So I think in the next 3 or 4 years, we're gonna have some really good actual stream gauge data.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're requesting canal improvements analysis, or recommending?
That's one possible alternative, right?
Yep.
Let's say we do something where we can reduce our canal losses from 10% to 5%. We can run that and see what that looks like.
And versus the cost.
And then what is that gonna take to be able
Yeah.
to reduce it by that amount?
So lining or encasing or whatever. Okay, and then, I'm just moving this, optimize operations. Moving this
Well,
along, because it's
no,
almost 5:30.
Yeah, well, we've got 35 minutes, so take our time on the next 3 pages. So, on this area, I would like to go through what it means, how are you defining it, what's included? I mean, this is,
This is not so this isn't the discussion about this. This is just to tee up the whole next meeting to discuss this.
Before we get into the
What we were wanting some feedback on is the model scenarios. The 159, or,
right.
we're back to that conversation.
Oh, okay, not the strategic alternative.
We're just teeing it up, at this
We're
point.
ready for that.
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, we've been saying we couldn't put watershed here because it's not we can't model it, but then we said if we model this, we'll be able to show how much we could improve. And so it's like, okay, well,
Which is,
it's not clear.
yeah, it's,
So we are not to the point where we have enough data to confidently model meadow restoration. We're trying to move into that direction. It's more literature-based right now.
But we also we're not at a point where you want to talk about any of the potential strategic alternatives either, right?
It's a whole meeting.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, right. We're not in any of those places yet. That I,
We're back to this.
Right,
Okay.
we can write it in, watershed.
I wrote it on mine.
I'm sorry. I'm lost from what was intended for this slide. You want to tee it up for the next meeting, but we're not to talk about it because there's
no data provided. I don't think the conversation would be overly productive. What we were more getting at was we would like some feedback on the model run scenarios that we'll be looking at. It's like, that is the decision point.
that is
So,
slide
page
36.
Page 14.
Yeah, you wanna go,
37.
Yeah.
yep,
I don't believe you.
there you go.
Number 10 was, you mentioned, there was outline or
Yeah, so 10 is median climate
mhm.
and the 2022 consumptive demands repeated every year.
No increase
No
in
change.
demand.
No increase.
It's for us to have a baseline.
Uh-huh.
okay.
Our demands don't change between. like,
No.
50
But our baseline being 2022 demand, and this is on the raw water side.
No, it's on both. The demand includes raw and treated.
Yeah.
But we
Yeah.
also concluded demand was not gonna move the needle that much either
For the
way.
treated water was not included.
Correct. Treated water demand it has a component of the demand, but in large, it's raw water use.
Got it. Okay.
So, we're back to, I think what I heard you say, we're looking at, to have input on this chart, right?
And why only 3? Is it a cost?
Uh-huh.
And what does it cost per run of each of these?
I don't
I mean,
know
like,
that I could.
how much would it be if we said, oh, we really want?
Well, we just had that $250,000 change order, so we.
I know, but I didn't know if that was
And remember that,
directly
I think there's
corresponding to this.
5 alternatives in the.
And
area
the
run, is that
scope,
right?
right.
5 strategic
Yeah.
alternatives, which would be run for the 3 selected.
You run for all 3 scenarios.
So that's really 15 that you're running.
Well, I'm gonna throw something out as just, I can't see any reason to do a wet scenario based on how the trends are going. I just put that out to the board.
Remember, the wet scenario has just as high a probability of occurring as the low
The
scenario.
dry
You
scenario.
said the probability is the same.
All 3 do.
We are saying that we, with climate change, are just as likely to have a wet scenario.
We have been,
We've had
have
for
been
the
all.
last 2 years.
We have been all along.
It rained.
But you
wet,
still have shortages under the wet scenario.
Okay, I'm down, I get it.
A lot of it gets confusing because it's also the shift in the timing of the diversions.
Yeah.
So before, when we would start to ramp up diversions because snow's melting, that's the same time demand's ramping up. What we're showing is that the snow melt is happening earlier, so it's topping off the reservoir sooner, and then we have to draw them down sooner, and we have less snowpack to refill them.
Yeah.
Yep, right, later on.
So,
What is the
which
staff,
would you choose?
well, what is the staff recommendation?
I'm Stafford. Who wants to rub the crystal ball?
Particularly, I like wider bookends, some people like narrower ones, but what's gonna give us the most information? Is that right?
Well, 5 is probably important,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
right? That's showing a reasonable increase in demand that is consistent with what we have historically seen.
And I would think 4 is important. Dry with median demand?
I like the bookend scenario, I do like the bookend scenarios to be a little bit wider. I don't know how realistic a high demand scenario is, but
2, 5, and 8?
Well, no, see, I was thinking.
I wouldn't
4
do that.
No.
4, 5, and 10. And 9?
No, we want 10 no matter what, is
Yeah,
what
we
companies.
want 10 no matter what.
And
And so-
we're choosing 3?
Hmm?
We're choosing 3, making 3 choices, or 4?
3, 10's already made,
In the bag.
Just with 2, right?
and you probably want 5.
We probably want 5, I agree. Yeah.
I think 4, 5, and 8 are good.
Yeah, I was gonna say 4, 5, and 8, or 4, 5, and 10.
Well, with 10 is a given,
10 is a given.
10's a given.
We get 3 more in
Yeah.
addition.
Oh, I was confused.
10's a given because it's a baseline in which we could compare it to.
So we get to choose 3, not,
You could choose 3.
we don't get to choose 2, we get to choose 3.
Yeah, we have to have a baseline for you.
Baseline is already chosen.
If you don't have a baseline, you have nothing to compare it to.
Correct.
It's like picking the lottery numbers.
It's 1.7 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, give me a reason not to choose
We could-
a straight line through the middle with number 2.
Huh?
Well, you don't want to do that because then you're only looking at one climate change scenario. So I would recommend that you would pick a scenario under which all 3 of the climate change models are represented.
Yeah, exactly, like 3, 5, 7, 10.
I go for wider bookends just to know if we're,
And what does that represent?
2, 5.
it'd be 159.
1, 5.
Oh, I see, okay.
Wow.
I just see 1 as being like, ain't gonna happen.
Very improbable.
I mean, I could see the really dry climate,
I
but I
asked
can't
Jennifer.
see the, just increasing demand.
But remember, the demand increase isn't all that much. So the reason, so demand, it is only showing, it's hard to hear, it's only showing additional add-on. So it's 1.5 times our current historical rate of new basically
So it's
raw
not a
water.
great big demand
No,
increase.
it's only showing, what we say was 20 acres more.
But then some of these, the charts
Yeah.
made it look like it was much greater.
I am not advocating that you plan for high demand.
No.
I understand, but we need to know where that is.
I just think the bookends is kind of, wider bookends gives you a little bit more of a test on
My first gut feeling was.
whether we're
was the
surpassing what we
widest-
get.
Widest we
Yeah.
could go. Trevor started,
narrowing it.
narrowing up,
Mhm.
but,
No,
this is a time.
he needs to chime in.
I know, Trevor, I'd like to hear what you have to
Trevor, you need to chime in
say.
on this one.
Trevor, oh wait, we have questions, hold on. And one's from Trevor.
Oh, and one is from Trevor, oh, good.
Okay, Aaron, let me go through them. Aaron, from Circle says, we have collected hydrology for the spring, so, oh, he's referring to Norden. He's giving an update on the Norden meadow restoration data, and he says that they have collected hydrology for spring, summer, and fall, but haven't had time to do QA, QC.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be good. I'm real happy that we're gonna be able to share and collaborate on that monitoring. Trevor states, I see no value in randomly selecting 3 scenarios to spend more time and money investigating. If there was a probability with some bound in time, 10 years, 20 years from now, I might understand. Rather disagree on some increased storage goal based on the current data.
Okay.
And then Aaron Circle says 15810. 15810. 15810.
Oh, man, what?
And you said 159?
Yeah, I think the only issue with 15810 is it misses the wet year climate change model.
I mean, we've just experienced 3 of the driest years and the wettest.
And the wettest, yes.
I mean, that has to be in
Yeah,
the
the-
modeling.
Well, the wide bookends for me are just a good indicator of whether or not we are way off base at any given time, if you're actually exceeding the bookends, but.
Okay. Well, I'll go with 1, 5, 9, and 10. I mean, that was my first gut feeling several weeks ago. So,
But see, I tend to agree with Aaron here at, number 8 seems like it makes sense because, the severely wet year and a 20% cut.
8, you're missing the wet year climate change model.
that
See.
comes early in
Yeah, okay,
February,
I get
March.
it, I get it.
We're spilling like crazy.
Mm-hmm. And why not 4, the dry and medium demand?
You could do 4, 5, 6, it's just all showing pretty basic demand.
Because the demand is,
Yeah, the median demand scenario,
The bookends?
Pretty vanilla.
you could, yeah, the median demand scenario is just showing an increase in demand based off a historical average and modifications to ET based off of climate change.
so I'm hearing you say that we wouldn't gain that much information.
No, I think you do gain information from the standpoint that you're hitting all three climate change models.
Yeah.
You know, somewhat of demand as you can. Modification of demand is valuable when we're looking at how we operate the reservoirs.
Yeah.
Because of how we split water.
Right.
However, 4, 5, and 6, I mean, you're inherently gonna understand that that is your historical average demand.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not showing any large increases in ET.
It's not showing any increases, okay.
Yeah, and it's not showing an absorption of the soft service area.
Mm-hmm.
So do the scenarios that are selected play into then the modeling of the strategic alternatives, and how do those two interplay?
Right, so then what you would do is you would say, you know, one of the strategic alternatives is A, and then we run that strategic, say it's a reservoir operations, it could be reducing the carryover storage. We can run that back through the model for those three scenarios. We just have to limit what we're running at some point.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
But 159 gives you the most information that you could use.
It's a board decision. I mean, I tend to go with 159, but I can understand the other perspectives as well.
I do think it would be valuable to have one in each.
Mm-hmm. In each of the climate scenarios.
I personally, I struggle with the high and dry, although you point out that there's not that much difference in demand.
And probability.
No, in the effect of high demand versus median demand is what you were saying, right?
Right.
In terms of
The difference is the infill of the soft service area, and I believe it had a higher increase in ET value assigned to it.
Yeah.
Mr. Schutz is requesting, he thinks that, I think 8 is important to see the benefits of low demand without offsetting wet climate patterns. So Chris is essentially saying, go with the median climate change scenario and low demand. Gus, I'm sorry.
Gus, sorry, I'm a numerical modeler,
Oh, good.
so just my, just an opinion.
Yeah.
I agree with Jennifer, if you want the widest range, for planning purposes, again, this is just for planning, 159 will give you that. If you don't think the low scenario, which in my opinion, the low scenario is probably less likely because really the median and the high scenarios are gonna probably see either the same or increased demand moving in the future. So I would suggest either 159 for the widest, or for probably a more realistic range, 156, if you need to do that. But definitely you wanna hit each one of those because again, they're equally powerful from a, again, these are ensemble runs and they run, hundreds if not thousands of these things and kind of average them. But that will give you the range. Again, it's just for planning scenarios, and the bookends are really what's important, because you want to know how low we're going to go, how high are we going to go, and what's kind of generally in the middle.
And then,
I have 2 cents on that.
yeah, and I think one of the things that Dave, and I'm sure Gus probably is along the same lines, is when you're doing this kind of planning, and specifically with climate change that has changed so much, even in the past 5 years, it helps us gauge whether we are completely off base and things are way worse than we thought, or it's zero issue.
So 159 gives us a better planning.
If you want to include like the whole possibilities of that variability, because there's also some things that you necessarily can't bake into your predictions, but if you increase that variability, then sometimes those things kind of wash out and you analyze for them without actually realizing that you are in your planning scenario, if that makes sense.
Well, I guess
So it's an unknown, and you kind of account for that by having a wider, yeah.
I don't understand why we would model a wet scenario with a low demand and just a 20% cut. It's like, if we have a low demand.
My question.
Yeah, it's like, that doesn't, I could see maybe doing 8, where,
So medium,
Yeah, well, because you gotta remember,
I don't understand.
so the climate change scenarios are independent of the demand. So you can have, let's say, Nevada County, you know, global pandemic 3.0 happens and Nevada County population drops by 50%. That would reduce your demand.
Correct.
Your climate would still be what's happening. So you gotta remember, these are independent, kind of variables that are being combined. And that's why it gets challenging, because you have what's called the combinatorial explosion, where we pick 3 scenarios. Well, now that's 15 different model runs when you
Yeah.
account for, you know, the 3 by 2 by, you know, all that stuff. So it's very challenging. So the easiest way to reduce your level of effort is to just say, okay, this scenario is probably on one end of the, you know, high demand, low supply, and then low supply, high demand, and get everything in between there.
And everything in between.
So, but yeah, if you had unlimited money, then yeah, model everything.
Right.
But it takes a very long time to analyze these.
Okay.
Typically, it's not the model run that takes a long time, it's the actual analysis. and
Analysis afterwards.
Trying to think about.
Yeah, right. This.
And then Trevor had another comment. He states, I would agree that 156 would be most useful if I had to choose. So we all agree on, well, 10's a given.
Is a given.
And it sounds like 5, when we agree on 5, right?
One and five are all good.
1 and 5.
Okay, then you have one more.
6 or
Well, and
9.
he's saying 9, or 8.
I would, yeah,
Our consultant's saying 9. I mean, you're saying 9.
I'd say 9.
I can see the value of doing a wet, because if you've got these big infusions of moisture coming through, I think knowing how
Or
the
atmospheric
system
rivers.
can handle it and be optimized would be really helpful. Not that you don't have some of the spikes in the other models, but those were the most apparent in the super wet years.
And
Yeah, so if you go with one,
Source of water.
right, if you go with 1, 5,
159.
and then my recommendation, is no matter what you do, you pick another wet scenario one.
Right.
The demand doesn't bother me as much as not having all 3 as climate change scenarios.
Yeah.
A median demand with.
Yeah, so if you're going with 9, that addresses that.
And well,
You want to make sure you have all 3 climate scenarios represented.
Yeah.
and I have another question for
Oh.
Gus. Why would you pick 6 over 9 or 9 over 6?
Just the odds
Bigger.
of demand
Yeah.
decreasing are probably lower than it staying about the same as what it has been.
Well, not from the perspective of state regulation.
Right.
So
Oh, yeah, so,
it's an arbitrary demand reduction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it depends on how you want to put it, but yeah, if you're just looking at just pure water demand without additional regulations on there, then you would expect it to stay the same. But if you're mandated to reduce it, then I would suggest 9.
9, okay. That covers us with the
Yeah,
state.
I hadn't considered the future, reductions that
The
are
reductions.
required.
There's some very legitimate litigation or legislation going through right now
Right.
that will require.
Okay, so
Fine.
159.
Yeah, thanks. In over 20 years on the PCWA board, I observed 3 droughts, basically. And you've got a statistical kind of an option, maximize your options with statistics. I would offer that in all 3 of those droughts, people voluntarily reduced their demand significantly. And I recall in 2014, that drought, NID's newsletter boasted about how much people had saved water in that supply use. And so you will never see a high demand because people will use at least 20% less when it's drought. Because our people are good people. They're responsible.
So I'm,
You got Diana.
oh, sorry, Diana.
I just have a short one. Based on what he said as well, I would say 3, 5, 7, because when there's lots of water, there can be high demand. 5 is your baseline thing. And then when it's dry, you probably would go into your drought contingency, and that would be 7. So I would suggest.
Oh, that's interesting.
Thank you.
There's that.
And then there's that, which is interesting.
So we were settled on 1, 5.
5,
You want 6 or 9?
9.
9. Covers us with the.
Yeah, it's just,
state
it gives you the largest.
We can't foresee what's going to.
I know, it's like, good God.
Yeah, we need the wider.
Fine. 159 makes me feel like I should sing and dance.
Yeah.
Are you gonna make up a song about
I
him?
wanna see that.
All right.
We're gonna take a straw donkey, pole and
Have a not seen your donkey.
Okay, so then we're kind of up to the next steps, so now that we have those, the next meeting will be focused on strategic alternatives, and it will be better fleshed out. This was, and, you know, Doug did question me about teeing this up, thinking I was gonna cause a mess, so I clearly did. Doug was right. Yep, Doug was
You
right.
did well.
Also, I want to, just 1 minute or less, is talk about the extended irrigation season
Yes.
analysis.
Yes.
So,
What page are you on now?
this is 35, going back in
Oh.
time. I understand why people would want to do this. I really can understand that. I really struggle, though, since we have just seen page after page after page how we do not have enough water, how we could extend our irrigation system with any kind of, like, logic. So I get why, you know, I get why it's needed, but I don't see how it could possibly be realistic.
How we can do it, right?
Yeah.
But the justification for it is real simple. If they do not have water at a certain time, crops are gone, pastures are dried up, no one's gonna irrigate. So then our demand goes down.
Well,
Could we analyze that?
isn't that inherently already baked into the impacts on demand based off of ET? I think it is. I'm looking for some, because Katie's not here. I thought I saw
Well,
her.
because I think it's still in the operations model, it's still stopping irrigation season. So that demand number is not gonna be,
And so it's stopping it. Well,
our demand's gonna drop in, I'm assuming that's, because our
I think
demand's
that's
gonna
in
go
the-
way down once October 16th hits.
Right.
Currently.
That's right.
So we take down our storage, and I mean, I understand if we need to do the analysis, but I would want to have the ability to at least understand the analytical methodology. So in other words, assumptions like it's paid 100% by raw water customers, that a raw water canal has do we give this water to every canal, or is it limited? I mean, I need to understand what the scope of the analysis is, because if we're just saying the raw water season is gonna be extended by, let's just say, 2 weeks for every raw water customer, I'd like to know, out of the 6,000 customers, how many have requested this? And
And how many really need it?
How many really
need it,
Yeah.
and what's the cost? I mean, I'm assuming you would do that, all of that, but I just can't imagine.
I don't know of anybody who requests it. I hear it being talked about, but I've never heard of an actual request.
Oh,
Have you, Chip?
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
No one asked me.
No, hundreds.
It kind of blurs the lines between people asking for fall and winter water.
Yeah.
We get a lot more of that, it seems, than the spring water, because naturally it's usually wet in the spring. But, we have had a lot of requests for it, and then the board might remember, we had a little presentation on it about challenges regarding,
Right.
and kind of in line with what you're.
And wetting up the canal, keeping those canals wet, and would we be serving a small number of customers at an
The
expensive,
request has always been for just extend the season for all.
for everybody, right? That is a huge hit. It's
Well,
huge. It's a huge hit.
But you're running about 3,000 acre feet a week right now, whereas during the high season it's 6,000 acre feet.
Yeah, roughly.
And so it'd be reduced down for a couple of weeks. But,
That's directly affecting our carryovers, so.
Yes.
yeah,
Time to,
but fall water delivery is the same thing, right?
fall, water is limited, canals and limited customers.
Right. I'm just gonna put the ad out there, or
Yeah,
a lot of people say, my pasture dried up, now what? Wait for the rains, and they lose that. That's a heavy investment on these pastures. And other people are saying, well, I don't have water in the canal, well, if we have a big fire, I can't put it out. And so I've heard it more than most probably, that,
All great concerns, it's a matter of do we have it?
yeah.
Right.
No, I
at what
agree,
cost?
but-
And at what cost?
But I think it, to come back to Karen's thing, it's gonna be a longer study than what we're going to entertain now. You know, but we need to plan for it.
I don't think so.
Well, there's also something to be said to analyzing it, so you could have a real answer when you get asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could say, okay, well, we can do that, but it increases our unmet demands on average by 4% or whatever.
And it increases the
Yeah,
rate
I
to
would
the.
be curious how many customers are talking about how many acre feet we're talking about, because I think I feel like it's a low number, but that's.
That's what I would think, but, you know, it'd be hard to decide what canals it goes down.
Right.
Why don't we just put some more thought into it?
Yeah, if we could just have, here's what the analysis will entail and what we'll see at the end, that would,
Okay.
I would appreciate that.
That's fair.
I mean, and personally, we put in a pond, so we would have that water.
Right, well,
All right, and
yeah.
that may be the cheaper way for every ranch, yada, yada, yada.
There's been, yeah.
Especially those-
Program, rebates on the large storage tank.
Yeah, it's not enough water to,
For me, it is,
well, don't drink much.
but my flowers do.
I know.
It's for flowers, for annual crops, yeah.
All right, and just, really quick, Trevor said he's good with 9. So we're 159, 10.
Yes.
All right, we're looking great.
All right, Trevor.
That's all we had planned for this evening.
All right, and guess what? It's, 5:52,
Made the budget.
end of meeting.